Donald Trump is widely regarded as the worst president in modern American history. He almost overthrew the American government.
The government did this to us. We were normal, good, law-abiding citizens.
Killed tens, if not hundreds of thousands of Americans with his terrible handling of the pandemic.
900,000 lives have been lost to the virus in this country.
And destroyed America's reputation in the eyes of many. It's pretty clear that Trump was bad. But just how bad was Trump actually? Trump did a lot to create the image of a bad person right from the very start, long before he ran for office. He was first known as a sleazy and aggressive businessman in the real estate game. His first entry of nasty public statements occurred in 1989.
And it's more than anger, it's hatred.
Enter the Central Park Five. The Central Park Five case was a widely publicized court case where a group of Black and Latino teenagers were wrongfully convicted of severe crimes. Rather than wait for the trial to run its course, Trump bought full-page space in the major newspapers of New York City with a bold, inflammatory statement: bring back the death penalty, bring back our police. He never apologized or commented on the rudeness of his manner, despite the teenagers being acquitted on DNA evidence. Because Trump never apologizes for anything. He's just that kind of guy. If people thought that would be the last of his brazen attitude, they were wrong. A decade would pass, and Trump would move around in the real estate world as usual, but he would become an even more famous character as the host of the reality TV show The Apprentice. He was known for his no BS personality and the famous "you're fired" line.
You're fired.
Nobody could have predicted, though, that this would carry over to the highest office in all of the land. His fiery rhetoric remained while he worked on the show, but he made his politics clear, if they weren't already at this point, by joining the birther movement. In 2011, President Obama released his birth certificate to prove his eligibility to hold office, amidst criticisms by conservatives claiming that he was not born in the United States.
White House releasing copies of President Obama's original long-form birth certificate.
He, of course, was. His paperwork showed that he was born in Honolulu, Hawaii. So after all this drama, Obama decided to have a little bit of fun with it at the White House Correspondents Association dinner shortly afterwards. With Trump in the crowd, who questioned the validity of the birth certificate, Obama saw the perfect opportunity to clap back. So he poked fun at Trump's role in The Apprentice, likening it to a rehearsal for a presidency that he would never have. Trump appeared quite angry with these comments, and eventually Obama's take would age like milk. 4 years later, the Don announced that he was running for president.
I am officially running for president of the United States.
He started off with an audacious and hard-hitting speech. He wasn't just concerned about the poor state the country was in.
25 countries are better than us at education.
He supposedly knew why it was this way. He pointed the finger at Mexicans coming over the border.
When do we beat Mexico at the border? They're laughing at us.
This was all a part of a big gambit. He positioned himself as a political outsider who could bring about substantial change from the inside as an experienced businessman. He used his wealth as a sign of success. It was supposed to be evidence of something greater, evidence that he was not beholden to donors. But while he wasn't beholden to donors per se, he was certainly beholden to his wallet, and his tenure as president would go on to prove that. Trump would inevitably win this election and make a severe blow to the Democratic Party by leveraging a considerably polarizing point of the American electoral system, the Electoral College.
Donald Trump wins.
Donald Trump wins the presidency.
Hillary actually won the popular vote with 65.85 million votes, whereas Donald Trump received only 62.98 million votes moving forward. But Trump was essentially able to do a populist revolt by visiting the parts of the country Hillary Clinton was not interested in. Hillary campaigned in big urban mega city blobs, but Trump campaigned in coal country. He received 304 electoral votes, well surpassing the 270 electoral votes needed to win the presidency. On the other side, Hillary Clinton received only 227. The thing is, the votes were actually very close in many individual states, and these numbers don't paint the full picture. In PA, he only won by a margin of 0.72 percentage points. That's a difference of 44,292 votes. That's how close this election really was, and it shows that Trump wasn't nearly as popular as you may think. He made a habit of insulting his opponents with terms like lying Ted,
And this guy's a liar.
crooked Hillary,
Crooked Hillary.
and recently Meatball Ron was another popular one. He operates like a bully, and it works most of the time. There are many cases where this approach is not nearly as effective as he may think it will be, and that evidence would reveal itself with his presidential kickoff in 2016. Presidents are often defined by their first 100 days, and in Trump's case, he took advantage of the momentum of a successful campaign to get the ball rolling on a ton of policies that seemed positioned to make immigrants from just about anywhere into second-class citizens.
They're poisoning the blood of our country. That's what they've done.
Or in some cases, not able to enter the country and start a new life for themselves at all. He first turned his eyes to the southern border with Mexico, which he just got done yapping about on the campaign trail. Images of the border wall have become something of a symbol of Trump's conscience, and America as an idea. Its jagged, rusty, and ugly stature was described by Trump as beautiful? Weird. The thing is, while he made a big fuss out of telling his voting base that Mexico was going to pay for the wall, that's not at all what happened, among other things Trump promised. No, what actually happened was you paid for the wall. You, the American taxpayer. With a little bit of help from the Department of Defense, you also paid for a wall that didn't work very well. The effectiveness of it is debated. By April 2023, about 450 miles of the border wall were constructed by the end of Trump's term. But there's an important detail here. Only about 80 miles of that wall were brand new barriers. Huh? Yep. That's right. When Trump talked about his big, beautiful wall, there was already a wall there to begin with. It was laid down under the Secure Fence Act of 2006 by George W. Bush.
Witness the signature of the Secure Fence Act of 2006.
While Donald Trump was still the host of The Apprentice. When Trump became president, there were already 654 miles of barrier along the nearly 2,000-mile-long border between the United States and Mexico. So he wasn't doing anything new. He was just adding this to his rhetoric to rile up supporters about immigration policy. It was a tactic to leverage voters, not defend the border. His policy wasn't as much about building a wall as much as maintaining it. So maybe instead of saying,
Build that wall.
he could have said, maintain that wall. Trump's costs to maintain that wall were expensive, not exactly on brand for his business-focused, cost-effective image. He used executive actions and national emergency declarations that appropriated over $15 billion for this project, assuming the figures from the Treasury Forfeiture Fund are true. Immigration was a big component of Trump's image and his approach to politics. The more he could rile up his base and get them mad, the better. So he took it a step further and established a sweeping policy that made life for a whole different group of immigrants, Muslim immigrants, awful. Trump's so-called Muslim ban, and we know that was the official term for it because that's what him and his aides called it,
Muslim ban, but we were totally prepared.
Was a travel ban that explicitly barred entry to the US from many Muslim-majority nations. The initial countries on the ban list were Iran, Iraq, Libya, Somalia, Sudan, Syria, and Yemen. Over 135 million people from the targeted countries were affected, with 60,000 visas revoked in the first week of the program's implementation, according to the US State Department. The supposed reason Trump wanted to do this was to keep terrorists from coming into the US.
Hatred toward Americans by large segments of the Muslim population.
Which is hilarious, considering the reason many of those individuals were coming to the US was because they were trying to get away from terrorism. Trump said the countries on the ban list could not or would not give enough info about their people. Again, the whole terrorism thing may have made that a little bit difficult. It's hard to prove no risk of anything. What is easier to prove, though, is if something is legal or not. And in this case, Trump's policy had questionable legal grounds. The Attorney General at the time, Sally Yates, was fired, of course, for not complying with it.
The Attorney General to turn around and say, I'm not going to uphold this lawful executive order is clearly a dereliction of duty, and she should have been removed, and she was.
6 different judges then ruled against the ban, and Trump was eventually forced to capitulate some aspects of the policy.
I'm certain the president will not like this decision, but it is his job, it is his responsibility.
It makes sense because the international community heavily criticized the ban as well. Germany's Chancellor, Angela Merkel, strongly opposed the US entry ban on refugees and people from specific countries. She asserted that the fight against terrorism must not involve suspecting individuals because of their origin or religion. Despite blowback, Trump pressed on. He didn't just want to enact new policies, but take down existing ones that were favorable towards immigrants, actively trying to impede on the rights of migrants. Another hugely combative stance Trump took on Mexican migrants was on the matter of DACA, a program that helped kids who came to the US when they were young. They could stay here for a while without getting sent back, and could even get a work permit. So-called dreamers is the term used to refer to them, and they contribute an estimated tens of billions of dollars to US GDP, as evidenced by studies performed by the Center for American Progress and the Cato Institute. The whole DACA drama kicked off at the start of Trump's term and just kept going and going. And a lot of people were going to be affected had the program been eliminated. But Trump had to let that go for a little while. Naturally, former US President Barack Obama had some harsh criticisms of Trump's idea.
I mean, these are kids who were brought here
by their parents. They did nothing wrong.
Stating to target these young people is wrong, and it is cruel. But for Trump, cruelty was just another day at the office, and a part of the process. Immediately following the call to disband DACA, federal judges in California, New York, and the District of Columbia issued injunctions ordering the administration to maintain the program.
I'm not going to support just doing DACA by itself.
Preventing its termination and allowing recipients who were considered current at the time able to renew their status. Trump, ever the businessman, tried to negotiate with Congress for a legislative solution concerning DACA that was also going to provide funding for the border wall. But this never happened because he could never get a reasonable offer on the table. Ultimately, the US court system would fight Trump on this one, and he'd have to deal with them blocking his absurd demands consistently. This obviously kept many migrants waiting with bated breath as to what was going to happen next time. But the thing is, Trump was not a stranger to spats with the legal system. This is all a running act for the Don. With his hand on the Bible just this year, Trump University was facing lawsuits of fraud at the same time he was being inaugurated as president, to which he settled with a $25 million sum. And he's been accused with multiple cases of sexual misconduct.
President Donald Trump liable for sexual abuse.
Regardless, not everything was about immigration to Trump. Those policies were part of his broader America First message, particularly when it came to the relationship the US had with Europe. America First really meant me first, as in Trump and his crony friends on Wall Street. 2016 was a hectic year for many Americans, but before it ended, it would get even more worrisome. US intelligence would drop a big bombshell about how Trump had gotten to office in the first place.
US intelligence officials are warning of a new election interference threat, and it's coming from the same source in Russia.
They had suspected that Russia was trying to influence the process of American elections, and Trump did not like that shadow.
Russia, nonsense.
If you thought 2016 was bad, then 2017 was going to be a whole lot worse. President Trump then fired FBI Director James Comey as news of the election scandal broke out.
FBI Director James Comey fired by President Trump.
Comey was checking crooked Hillary's emails for that very same thing, but he was also going to investigate Trump. Shockwaves reverberated throughout the U.S. intelligence community. So after James Comey's firing, the federal government appointed a guy named Bob Mueller to a high-profile office in the Department of Justice.
Deputy Attorney General Rod Rosenstein has appointed former FBI Director Bob Mueller to now oversee the Russia probe and look at the possible connections between Trump campaign associates and Russia.
Mueller was tasked with probing Trump's campaign and its ties to Russia to figure out what the heck was going on. And that would follow till the end of his term. On the 1st of June 2017, Trump announced intentions to withdraw from the Paris Agreement.
The United States will withdraw from the Paris Climate Accord,
a landmark international accord aimed at combating climate change. It's a bit strange because Trump campaigned on jobs, 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 and green energy would provide a ton of growth for the US. Renewable energy has outpaced traditional energy sectors considerably in job creation. The Zero Emission Transportation Association claims the U.S. can create over 2 million jobs by making a deliberate effort to transition to EVs by 2030. These are all American jobs that could give American immigrants a fresh start, but this was not ideal for the Trump administration because they wanted to leverage the populist stance against climate science. He wanted to make the world know that America was not going to play ball. They were the ones in control. After the Don was done being the villain with his policy in Paris, he turned his sights back to home soil, where he was more interested in helping his big banking buddies clear checks, instead of helping cull climate change. The first thing he did was reform tax policies in a way that would help the guys at the top and little else. The average American would not get a kickback. Trump wanted to sell himself as a businessman who could get things done, and he did, but not for the average person. He did a lot for his rich friends, though, the ones who make up 1% of the population. He prioritized deregulation to do this, and especially a big corporate tax cut. His economic plan was focused on two main actions. First, in 2017, he passed the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act. This lowered the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%. Secondly, he started a trade war with China.
It's the greatest theft in the history of the world.
The first behavior was great if you were high on the hog at a multi-million-dollar or multi-billion-dollar corporation. But as usual for Trump's economic policies, the average person did not benefit from this. This tax cut was one of the biggest tax overhauls in U.S. history, comparable to that of the Tax Reform Act of 1986 under the Reagan administration. Following in the footsteps of the flawed logic of supply-side economics, commonly called trickle-down economics, or even more commonly, a complete load of nonsense, The theory implies that rich executives who have no incentive to put their money in the economy will somehow have that wealth trickle down to the average person as they participate in it. In this situation, thinking wealth will, quote, trickle down is like believing buying extra lottery tickets for one person raises others' chances of winning. Just because the wealthy have more money doesn't guarantee they will share it to help the economy. Professional economists do not give this idea any credit because it just doesn't make any sense. Economies are built from the bottom up, not the top down. Wealthy executives pocket the money for personal pleasure. The idea that Trump was going to help the little guy by removing the few things that were keeping the big guy from stepping all over him is insane. In fact, if we go further back in time, we can see that in the years between 1978 and 2018, CEOs of the 350 largest US companies received 940% raises. Earnings growth of typical workers did not match that threshold. In 2018, 46% of Americans lived paycheck to paycheck. Cost of living and payouts for the executive suites of companies have gone up, but average workers' wages have not. Trump selfishly fed into the cycle with his policies, and he also personally stood to benefit from the passing of said policies because his own businesses would reap the rewards of the tax cuts. The Tax Policy Center estimated that by 2027, anybody earning over $730,000 would see after-tax income increase by 3%, rather than the typical 0.4% increase earners in the American middle class got. Trump loved this particular plan of his, claiming, "We're unleashing a new era of American prosperity." The Center for American Progress bluntly retorted, "The reality is, the TCJA was more of a windfall for investors than a boon for workers." Trump frequently talked about the national debt, but did jack all to improve it. In fact, he backed a bill maintaining tax policies that were projected to raise the debt by more than $1 trillion.
Finances of our country are a mess.
As predicted by the Congressional Budget Office, Trump's presidency was driven by a transactional perspective that shaped his tax and international ideas, leading him to disapprove of the United States NATO membership. Donald Trump said that NATO was obsolete and many countries weren't paying what they should.
NATO members must finally contribute their fair share.
This comes from a suggestion within the guidelines of NATO that stipulates countries should aim for 2% of their gross domestic product to be spent on defense by 2024. Let's take a step back. It's true that some NATO members don't meet the 2% defense spending target. It's also true that there are only a couple of countries in the alliance that even meet that target to begin with. The United States is not like the countries of Southern and Eastern Europe, who was even meeting this rubric to begin with. Well, the United States, obviously, but some countries might surprise you, like Greece. The Baltic states pay their fair share because they share a border with Russia, led by Vladimir Putin, who Trump has characterized as a really cool guy. Poland also meets the 2% spending guidelines as a guard of Europe's eastern flank, but Trump doesn't seem to care about these contributions. Not everybody meets the 2% spending suggestion. But the countries that stand to be the most directly affected by an aggressive Russia are playing ball. So to characterize the alliance as obsolete just seems ridiculous coming from the country that was responsible for its establishment, particularly as relations with the Russian Federation sour. Trump has a lot of nice things to say about the Federation, which may have something to do with his stance on NATO. Maybe it's not that NATO's old, it's just that he doesn't like NATO. When the calendar turned back to 2018, the passing of Trump's Tax Cuts and Jobs Act the year prior was starting to pick up steam. As mentioned earlier, this resulted in tax savings for stock buybacks, not more jobs. The Securities and Exchange Commission in 2018 showed that corporations and the S&P 500 initiated a record $808 billion in stock buybacks in 2018.
It's a big year for buybacks.
And a congressional research service found that the GDP growth that occurred in 2018 seemed to follow pre-existing trends, not a causational link with the passing of the bill. The bill was often sold with the pretense of creating more jobs, though. That was Trump's whole shtick.
The big thing, of course, is tax cuts and jobs.
But one needle definitely shifted one way versus the other way, and not in a way that benefited 99.98% of the population. Trump was wheeling and dealing and irritating the heck out of European partners during this time period. So now he decided it would be a great idea to irritate China too. Instead of a military battleground, though, he'd pick an economic one. Trump was responsible for multiple tariffs on Chinese goods. And of course, China responded with retaliatory tariffs. Obviously, this created a much more confrontational relationship between the US and China, which wouldn't have a great effect on the American economy. China does not exist in a vacuum, so any tariffs imposed on them are going to be placed back on us, particularly soybeans, pork, and corn here in the States, which had an effect on farmers. This prompted the Trump administration to provide billions in aid to offset farmers' losses. The overall effect on the US economy in regards to the stipulations met with China is difficult to ascertain in data. But if there was one thing made clear, one administration isn't going to patch up a relationship with Xi Jinping. China was one part of Trump's foreign policy priorities, though. He also had dealings with the Islamic Republic of Iran, another example of his brash nature and propensity for high-stakes diplomatic card games, if you want to call them that. He would always go all in. For some reason, Trump never kept his cards close to his chest. He withdrew the United States from the Iran nuclear deal, a landmark agreement signed by Iran and various countries throughout Europe.
That the United States will withdraw from the Iran nuclear deal.
Basically, Iran wouldn't make nuclear weapons if they had economic sanctions lifted. There were restrictions on uranium enrichment and reduction of enriched uranium stockpiles. Trump said this was the worst deal ever, saying it was too lenient and did not prevent Iran from developing nuclear weapons. This, once again, was a load of nonsense. The International Atomic Energy Agency affirmed that Iran was complying, but on May 8, 2018, Trump announced that the US would withdraw from the deal and started sanctioning Iran again. Iran didn't like this, so Trump fired a missile at an Iranian general and blew him up, because that's the rational response when there's a disagreement. In 2018, fiery diplomacy ruled, agreements crumbled, and habitats for America's wildlife suffered in 2019. America's rivers, lakes, and waterfowl faced threats due to further Trump policymaking. Recognize this guy? This is an animal protected by the Endangered Species Act. Our friend, and more importantly, our symbol of freedom, the bald eagle. Donald Trump implemented several policies that weakened the Endangered Species Act and put our feathered friend, America's coat of arms itself, at more risk. One addendum allowed economic factors to be used in the decision-making process for listing species as endangered or threatened. There were also changes to critical habitat designations, making it even more challenging to label them. And there was also a rescinding of the blanket rule that gave the same level of protection to threatened species that endangered species had. Meaning, newly threatened species could end up not having the same stringent protections against harm and habitat destruction as endangered ones. Not fun for Big Birdie. There was also a weakening of the emphasis on climate change as a motivator of habitat destruction, and also just a weakening of the emphasis on climate change in general for the Trump admin. Trump tried to eliminate climate research funding for NASA, but had that shut down on the basis of it being nonsensical. Under the Trump admin, the EPA saw a decline in enforcement against polluters. There was a widespread reduction in the number of legal actions taken to hold bodies accountable for breaking pollution laws. This included budget cuts, staffing reductions, regulatory rollbacks, and a diminished focus on the science of climate change. Trump repealed the Waters of the United States rule to capstone this. It was a component of the Clean Water Act passed in 1972. WOTUS, as it was called, mainly affected streams and wetlands, but agricultural runoff, industrial waste, and other gunk enters small streams and wetlands that flow into bigger bodies like the Great Lakes.
More than half of our rivers, lakes, and streams apparently are too polluted.
Wetland health is hugely important for filtering pollutants, controlling floods, and providing habitat for wildlife. A lot of people throughout the conservation community expressed concerns about this rule's repeal, which they, of course, were not listened to. And Trump overlooked a big job market here too, because of course he did. The International Energy Agency reported that globally, renewable energy jobs reached a count of 11.5 million in 2019, with solar photovoltaic jobs leading with about 3.8 million jobs. The American Council for an Energy Efficient Economy points out that the efficiency sector accounted for 2.4 million jobs in 2019. And if that wasn't enough, the TCJA was still making the rich richer, without any of that coming back to working Americans. The National Association for Business Economics found that in 2019, 84% of businesses had not changed their investment or hiring plans due to tax cuts. Perhaps it was easy for aspects of Trump's environmental policies to get swept under the rug, when his reality TV show of a presidency took center stage on cable news. For 3 years, Robert Mueller waited in the shadows for his chance to make a significant impact on the Trump presidency. The special probe bided its time, independent of the recent impeachments we discussed. This investigation posed another intricate challenge to Trump's presidency. In 2019, the Mueller report finally went public as part of an ongoing drama that kicked off back in 2017 with James Comey's firing. It concluded, yeah, Russia interfered in the election in a, quote, sweeping and systematic fashion. Russia used social media, hacking, and other means of cyber subterfuge to stir the pot. But as for Trump's specific coordinated efforts to collaborate with the Russians, there was no evidence. Mueller continued to point out that Trump attempted to dismiss Mueller's special counsel, stating, while this report does not conclude that the president committed a crime, it also does not exonerate him.
Mueller was clear that his report, quote, does not exonerate, close quote, the president.
So while Trump didn't get direct blowback from the legal system here, it made one thing very clear to the American public. Russia was not our friend when it came to the sanctity of the American electoral process.
We're sick of them.
And he has his finger on the nuclear button. What does that mean for the world?
The Russia probe didn't go as far as many people thought it would, but that didn't stop the drama show. Many Americans still retained fears of an undercurrent, influencing their democracy in a troubling way. The pace for an unprecedented chapter in American politics continued from one hot seat to the next, as he faced an impeachment hearing for matters completely unrelated to the Mueller report. In the first impeachment, Trump was put on blast as a result of allegations concerning his dealings in Ukraine.
Whistleblower whose accusations about President Trump's phone call with the president of Ukraine now form the basis.
On July 25, 2019, Donald Trump was on the phone with Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky and asked him to investigate the former Vice President Joe Biden, as well as his son Hunter. Someone within U.S. intelligence saw this as a massive red flag and blew a whistle, and after a series of investigations by the House, it was revealed that Trump had withheld nearly $400 million in military aid to Ukraine. Some made the claim this seemed to be a deliberate attempt to strong-arm Zelensky into doing what Trump was demanding of him.
Trump with committing high crimes and misdemeanors.
The House charged Trump with abuse of power and obstruction of Congress. The second point due to Trump's behavior, which consisted of him refusing to release documents and blocking testimony from certain officials on the matter. Issued congressional subpoenas were obstructed by Trump. Then National Security Advisor John Bolton was stalled from testifying. So was Acting Chief of Staff Mick Mulvaney. But with the Republican majority Senate, the conviction didn't land. 52-48 on abuse of power, and 53-47 on obstruction of justice. The votes were strictly along party lines. Controversy continued. Trump may have held on for just a little bit longer if it weren't for a disastrous handling of the pandemic. A big part of his brand selling appeal was jobs.
I'll be the greatest jobs president that God ever created.
But the jobs shtick wouldn't stay as the pandemic finally struck for Trump. Right before the onslaught hit U.S. shores, Donald Trump called the pandemic the Democrats' new hoax at a campaign rally.
Now the Democrats are politicizing the coronavirus.
That statement, of course, did not age well. Donald Trump seemed to make a controversial statement about the pandemic just about every day.
I haven't touched my face in weeks. The infection from entering our country. We have no choice.
We have it very much under control.
On the topic of recommending the drugs hydroxychloroquine and azithromycin, he stated, "I feel good about it."
Feel good about it. That's all it is, just a feeling. I'm a smart guy. I feel good about it.
Trump's handpicked guy on the matter of the pandemic, Dr. Anthony Fauci, stated quite clearly, this information is anecdotal. In other words, not a good idea. Hydroxychloroquine suppresses the immune system, in case you didn't know, which is 100% worse than just not taking it at all. Now, chloroquine is a synthetic anti-malarial drug, not something to be used for the treatment of coronavirus. One of many, of course, extensively documented upper respiratory infections. Malaria is a bacterial disease of the blood. As it stands, there's no vaccine for it. Still, chloroquine can be used to treat rheumatoid arthritis. 1.5 million adults in the US have it. So if you were one of these people treating it with chloroquine at the time of the pandemic, unfortunately, those stocks were dried up by the end of March 2020. Thanks to Trump. Stuff like this was constant. Trump also made claims about ultraviolet lights and disinfectants that were, for lack of a better term, strange. He said,
supposing we hit the body with a tremendous, whether it's ultraviolet or just very powerful light. And I think you said that hasn't been checked, but you're going to test it. And then I said, supposing you brought the light inside the body, which you can do either through the skin or in some other way. And I think you said you're going to test that too. Sounds interesting. Right. And then I see the disinfectant where it knocks it out in a minute. And is there a way we can do something like that? Injection inside or almost a cleaning?
If this sounds dangerous, it is to anybody who was taught by their parents not to eat the Tide soap pods. But for everybody else, let's elaborate. Disinfectants like bleach and isopropyl alcohol corrode human tissue, leading to internal burns within the digestive tract, as well as damage to the bloodstream and vital organs. They don't just target harmful pathogens, but they would indiscriminately kill essential microorganisms in your body. Absorption of disinfectants leads to the medical classification of poisoning. The CDC and the WHO, plus manufacturers of disinfectant products, all issued urgent warnings about this claim. Inside the human body, Trump's claim is basically like saying you can use a flamethrower to clean a paper cut. There was also the ultraviolet light. Ultraviolet light is often used for its germicidal properties and can be used to treat water, purify air, and sterilize surfaces. It works by damaging the DNA or RNA of microorganisms, including those of your body. Again, it will cause potential tissue damage and all of the sorts of risks associated with UV exposure. Health professionals quickly responded to Trump's comments here by stating in polite terms, "Don't do this." Health professionals also took issue with the way Trump discussed masking. There was overwhelming consensus among health professionals on this matter, and Trump seemed to have cotton in his ears, potentially adding to an even more polarized political climate. At several points, Donald Trump refused to wear face masks in public.
This is voluntary. I don't think I'm going to be doing it.
Because that had become a political battleground in the culture war. The Department of Justice made a public statement to groups like the so-called Freedom to Breathe Agency, which provided printouts of a face mask exemption card, falsely claiming that the Americans with Disabilities Act provided recourse for someone with one of these cards to not have to wear a mask. Trump consistently went to blows with his own staff on the matter of the pandemic, whether it was U.S. Health and Human Services, trade officials, and even his own coronavirus task force. And the shadow of the pandemic followed him wherever he went. It even followed him to the next election cycle. To minimize risk of exposure to the pandemic virus, many voters decided to do so by mail. Many states expanded these options to allow safe, exposure, risk-free voting at their homes. A lot had to happen for this to take place logistically, but it happened. From the very beginning, Donald Trump frequently stated mail-in voting led to voter fraud. Again, another culture war divide. By the election's end, Trump declared victory prematurely, then claimed a rigged election when he lost. Naturally, mail-in voting was targeted quite a lot. The outrage from Team Trump was concerning enough to then Chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Mark Milley. If you're not acquainted with the term, the Joint Chiefs of Staff is essentially the president's highest brass in the Department of Defense, responsible for providing advice on matters of the military to the Secretary of Defense and the President. He felt like Trump was giving off vibes of a self-coup, similar to events following the 1932 election in Weimar, Germany. In case you're wondering, that was the election that ended with Hitler as Chancellor of Germany. Yes, an American general was concerned the president was pulling a Hitler moment. That's not exaggerative or biased reporting. That's what happened. Many lawsuits were filed, and none of them went through. One of his aides, former governor of New York, Rudy Giuliani, stated, "Courts decide elections, not people." This is true, and that's exactly what ended up happening. Many of the false claims by the Trump team on the matter of the election included the idea that dead voters had falsified votes cast. Votes were deleted, or, in one weird case, the Venezuelan voting machines were tampered with by Hugo Chavez, who has been dead for almost a decade. Then there was a demand placed at the foot of Vice President Mike Pence to reject the results as a matter of principle. This, of course, did not happen, but the Capitol rioters sure made an effort to try and make it a reality. Just for fun, let's travel across the country and see how those lawsuits panned out. In PA, the Trump campaign accused Pennsylvania Secretary of State Kathy Boockvar's handling of mail-in ballots as negligent. The U.S. District Court for the Middle District of Pennsylvania dismissed this. In Michigan, Jocelyn Benson, the Secretary of State there, was accused of not having access for poll watchers for ballot counting in Detroit. The Michigan Court of Claims denied the request for a halt on the counting of ballots. In Wisconsin, a recount actually increased Biden's margin of victory, and the Trump campaign alleged irregularities. The Wisconsin Supreme Court rejected the lawsuit. Another lawsuit like this was filed in the state of Georgia, and the U.S. District Court for the Northern District of Georgia dismissed that lawsuit. In Arizona, in-person votes in Maricopa County were supposedly a problem due to the way the poll workers managed the job. The Trump campaign wanted the state of Arizona to review those ballots, and the Arizona Superior Court in Maricopa County dismissed the lawsuit. For added measure, they included the detail that the number of ballots the Trump campaign was disputing wouldn't have changed the election's outcome anyway. In Nevada, the Trump campaign called foul for illegal dead votes. The Nevada Supreme Court rejected the appeal, stating the lower court had already found no evidence of such a claim. 2020 finally drew to a close, and the legal challenges pertaining to the elections finally seemed to come to an end. But the dramatic environment was not quite over yet. There was still great tension and disbelief on the matter of the election, carrying over into a powder keg that erupted into a violent display on taxpayer-funded property. The second impeachment pertained to the Capitol riot on January 6th. The charge, incitement of insurrection. This riot disrupted the Electoral College certification process under which votes were federally handled, confirming Joe Biden's victory as president in the 2020 election. Trump, prior to the riot, claimed that the election had been stolen and told his supporters to fight like hell.
Fight like hell. And if you don't fight like hell, you're not going to have a country anymore.
While these circumstances were certainly odd, Trump also called Georgia Secretary of State Brad Raffensperger during all of this.
Trump urged Georgia election officials this weekend to, quote, find thousands of votes.
The only person trying to change the outcome by nefarious means was Trump. Once again, the votes were along quite divided party lines, and a vote of 57 to 43 acquitted him in the Senate. This was the most bipartisan impeachment trial in U.S. history, with 7 Republican senators joining the Democrats to convict. The context here is important to indicate just how close these votes were, sometimes only by a difference of 4, further adding to the reality that there's probably never been a president as polarizing as Donald Trump. Trump left with a destructive legacy behind him. Over 100 environmental rules were dialed back, according to the New York Times. These environmental decisions realigned America's stance on global climate agreements and deregulation. Each policy reflects a broader philosophy that guided the White House during those years. The economic landscape, too, was reshaped by tax reforms that cut the corporate tax rate 14% and trade policies that redefined America's engagement with the global market, which required the Trump admin to bail out farmers with $28 billion in federal aid. And the nation's approach to healthcare and its response to the unprecedented pandemic further illuminate the complexities and contradictions of Trump's tenure, with over 24 million cases and 400,000 deaths due to the pandemic in the United States. Donald Trump came in on a divisive political climate. It was the start of some of the most bitter and divisive politics in American history. We will never see such politics for some time. We can talk about the bad of Trump all day, but what about his good policies? Is there a reason he was popular? Click on this video to see how good was Donald Trump actually.